Move on then, Vanessa, and let's start off with President Assad arriving in Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely historic occasion. Actually, even reporters and analysts in Syria were caught off guard. I saw Kevork Almasyan tweeting out, has Assad gone to Moscow? So it was sort of an unexpected visit, but obviously one that has been put together to really combat. We were talking in the last couple of weeks about how the West was capitalizing on the humanitarian tragedy of the earthquake, and I think I said last week, this is what the West wants to do, and the West I also include obviously Israel. And I did make the point, it doesn't mean that they're going to achieve this, but it's understanding the nefariousness of the Western plans, not responding to the humanitarian tragedy and yet exploiting it to increase financing to military groups under their control, which are dominated by Al Qaeda, etc. And in a sense, this is President Assad's and President Putin's response to that. And I think if we just watch the video of President Assad arriving at the international airport in Moscow.
Yeah, it has been playing while you've been talking there. So
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't see anything. Sorry. It's finished, I presume.
no, it's still going. But if you want to move
Oh,
on,
okay. All right. Well, I'll continue. So in the delegation that came with President Assad was the Minister of Economy from Syria, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of State Planning Commission, the Secretary General of the Council of Ministers, and of course, who joined them, but the Syrian ambassador to Russia now, who was formerly the permanent UN representative for Syria, Dr. Bashar al-Jafri, who everyone will know, of course, for the last astounding job that he did for years combating the propaganda that was being disseminated even through the UN. So you've got the images of President Assad actually arriving. He was met by Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov. Now, the opposition in Idlib and actually even in the West have made the point. In the West, it was there was very scarce reporting on this event, strangely. When I looked for BBC reports today, it was quite difficult to find them. It's quite normal for within Russian protocol. When President Raisi came to Moscow recently, he was met by the energy minister, not by President Putin. So the criticism that was coming out saying that President Putin wasn't affording enough of an honor to President Assad by meeting him personally at the airport is absolute nonsense. And in the video, you can obviously see that President Assad is met by a guard of honor. He was met by various Russian ministers, as I said, led by Bogdanov, who has been actually the point man for President Putin on Syria. And the discussions were basically about joint cooperation, strategic alliance, economy, trade, unity, the Russian special operation in Ukraine, and particularly unity of the non-aligned axis in the face of global chaos that is being manufactured by Western-led alliances, including, of course, NATO. And for Syria to reinforce its support for Russia and vice versa. Regional initiatives, the chemical weapons file, of course, was high on the list because the West is trying to use the OPCW corrupted report to criminalize the Syrian government and, of course, by default, the Russian government. And also the recent, which we'll talk about later, the Saudi-Iran deal that has been brokered by China, which for Syria, one might imagine that they would have problems about this because obviously Saudi Arabia was responsible for the financing of many of the terrorist groups that have been leading the war against the Syrian forces since 2011. And it's also worth noting that President Assad arrived on the 12-year anniversary of the start of the hybrid war, the Western-led UK, US intelligence agency-led hybrid war against Syria. So I'm sure that also wasn't a coincidence. Syria, in effect, doesn't have a problem per se with any kind of Iranian, Saudi Arabia rapprochement, because as we know, there is also talk of meetings between President Assad and President Erdogan. I will also talk about that a little bit later. But 40 investment projects were discussed by all the various ministers in various closed meetings with their respective ministers in Russia, including for energy, electricity, oil, and transport and housing, etc. So, this was really both historic and an unprecedented meeting for both sides. Then the tweet from Kevork Almasyan, that before he met with President Putin, Assad went to the tomb of the unknown soldier in Moscow and laid a wreath at the tomb, and was greeted by the commandant of Moscow, Lieutenant General Yevgeny Seleznev. Are you playing the video? Hello?
Sorry, yes, I am, yes.
Okay. So this is the video basically of President Assad heading to the tomb of the unknown soldier. I mean, this was really a state visit extraordinaire, and particularly at this time, post the earthquake, post the rapprochement with Egypt. The Egyptian foreign minister has been visiting Syria. There was the parliament of the parliamentary members of the Arab Union also came to Damascus. There was previously, of course, the meeting in Damascus between President Assad and Hamas. And so what we're seeing really is a reinforcement of the resistance alliances in the face of what we were talking about, this Western, both manufactured and domestic, manufactured abroad and domestic chaos. And then you have the image, I think, Mike,
Yes.
of the meeting between Assad and President Putin. And I mean, what I found fascinating, both in the photos and in the video that we'll play in a few seconds, is the body language between the two presidents. So President Assad, just to reiterate, in the video meeting between Putin and Assad, our position doesn't come only from the friendship and devotion that exists between us. Our position comes from the fact that the world really needs stabilization. Otherwise, it's heading for a major collapse. So if we just want to watch the actual video of the initial meeting.
Сейчас я хочу воспользоваться моментом, потому что это мой первый визит после спецоперации на Украине.
لأجدد موقفنا الثابت في دعم الموقف السوري من هذه الحرب ضد النازية القديمة الجديدة.
Повторить сирийскую позицию в поддержку этой спецоперации против неонацистов и старых нацистов.
وأقول قديمة جديدة لأن هذه النازية دعمها الغرب قبل الحرب العالمية الثانية واحتضن قادتها بعد الحرب والآن هو يستمر في دعمهم كما كان سابقا.
Я говорю, что это старый и новый нацист, потому что Запад, как и принимал старых нацистов у себя на земле, сейчас он стал их поддерживать в нынешнее время.
موقفنا لا ينطلق اليوم من الصداقة القوية بيننا ولا من الوفاء لمواقف سوريا تجاهنا.
Наша позиция не исходит только из-за дружбы между нами и из-за преданности, которая есть между нами.
وإنما من حاجة العالم اليوم لإعادة التوازن له وإلا سيذهب العالم اتجاه الانفجار والدمار.
наша позиция исходит от того, что мир действительно сейчас нуждается в стабилизации, иначе он пойдет к какому-то большому кроху.
And I just wanted to take this photo of the actual meeting and demonstrate the size of the table between the two presidents compared to, I think, the various meetings that President Putin has had with Western leaders where he's sat at his enormous meeting table. So clearly, not only the geopolitical friendship between these two world leaders, but there's clearly also a personal friendship between them, and I think that is very clear from the body language, from the conversations that they had, and the results of the meeting. Now, one important part that was discussed by both parties and also by the foreign ministers was the potential for a meeting in Moscow with Iran, Turkey, and Syrian foreign ministers. Now, Assad made it very clear in Moscow that, as the tweet shows, Moscow is working with Damascus to end the war. The meeting with Erdogan, President Erdogan, is related to Turkey leaving the Syrian territories, stopping the support of terrorism, and restoring the situation to what it was before the start of the war against Syria in 2011. So President Assad was actually very clear that he's looking for those guarantees from President Erdogan pre-election. I keep saying it, but the elections in Turkey are looming, and Erdogan is his back is against the wall, basically. And so then the media was basically picking up the story of this foreign minister meeting in Moscow. Moscow hosts a meeting on Syria in which the deputy foreign ministers, my apologies, of Turkey, Russia, Iran, and I've kind of crossed out regime just to highlight the fact that this lexicon is still being used by Western media. But the reality is contacts here in Syria, and Kivok Almasyan has also reported the fact that Damascus has cancelled the meeting because they don't have the guarantees from Erdogan. And this is a very important point to make, where people are talking about the occupation of Syria by Russia, by Iran. The reality is, and we've seen it many times, Syria, the government in Damascus has made decisions that are not to the liking of either Russia or Iran. Both of those countries are pushing for this making up between Assad and Erdogan because it takes a lot of pressure off them. But basically, Assad is digging his heels in, and he's saying, there is going to be absolutely no meeting. We're not giving Erdogan any victory in PR, in media, in pre-election campaigning until we receive the guarantees that we're looking for. So very clear message here that Damascus sovereignty, Syrian sovereignty, is always at the top of the pile in these negotiations. And as much as Russia and Iran like to put pressure on Syria to basically follow their roadmap, Syria very much has control over its own destiny, and that's an important point to make. The second point I wanted to make, Zionist media, of course, is in action now trying to basically destabilize the deal that's been brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran by China. They're putting out messages saying that Iran is going to stop supplying weapons or aid to Ansarullah, the resistance factions in Yemen. Absolute nonsense. Sayed Mohammed Morandi has put out a tweet denying this. So we're going to see a lot of this because, as you've already mentioned, Israel is not happy. Israel is going through pretty much a civil war situation within its own occupied territories. And the chances are that that war is going to spill out. Of course, we've seen the unmitigated aggression against Syria since the earthquake, the bombing of civilian airports and civilian residential areas in Damascus itself. And, Netanyahu is going to be looking to export the war outside to distract from what's going on internally. And that can only be against Lebanon, which is Hezbollah, or against Syria. Kevork Almasyan, in his most recent video on the subject, he believes that it will be with Lebanon. Of course, that would be suicide for Israel, because that would bring them into direct conflict with the army of Hezbollah, which has been building for some time in preparation for this kind of conflict escalation. But also, even with Syria, Syria has not been using the majority of its defenses against Israel. It's been holding back, waiting for this potential escalation to happen. So, as I said before, Israel is actually in probably its most vulnerable position for years. And not forgetting that Yemen even has missiles trained on the Israeli cities.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Well, let's just come on to the